Greetings and welcome to Mount Olympus. I am Hercules Invictus, and today on Living Mythology, I'm proud to bring you Brian Strivin. Brian Walker. Greetings, Brian. How are you?
I'm well.
I'm glad to
Well,
hear that.
anyway, tonight I thought we would talk about movie serials. It's one of my favorite types of films, in that they're very resourcefully made for the most part. Tend to be low budget affairs. Some of them are quite lengthy if you watch them from beginning to end. Most serials ran either anywhere from 12 to 15 chapters. There are some that were longer than that, and there are a few that are actually shorter. But most of them sort of fall into that 12 to 15 episode. And in a way, it kind of predates television programming quite a bit. Now, there are several factors that come into play when you start discussing early TV programming. And movie serials tend to, well, can be one of those factors, and I think they actually are. But I probably ought to define what a movie serial is, and it's just a continuing story, and sort of like one long film, but it's been cut up into a number of pieces. And usually, you get a new chapter every week, or sometimes every 2 weeks, at your local bijou, at your local theater. Um, Serials started really early on when, in terms of filmmaking. The first serials actually really started with the Edison Studios around 1910 or so. They Movie serials have, I guess, a lot of tropes that we're probably going to discuss. In a few minutes, I want to talk about the perils of Pauline. And when most people think of the perils of Pauline, they think of a woman being tied to railroad tracks, which you actually most likely does not happen in the perils of Pauline. And there's a reason I can't be entirely 100% sure about that. Uh, but the first serial really is from Edison Studios in New Jersey, your home state, or your current place of residence. And it was called What Happened to Mary, and it was released in 1912. And back in the early days of filmmaking, you didn't really have feature length films the way we know them today. You didn't have 90-minute movies or anything like that. What you had were a number of movies being shown sort of back to back after a while in film houses. And typically, films that you would see during this time were short, maybe one or two reels. And by saying one or two reels, that's usually anywhere from, let's say, 6 to 12 minutes. So these are pretty short movies. Um, and Edison's What Happened to Mary was a collection of 12 one-reel episodes. Uh, and it was tied to a serialized story that was published in Ladies' World magazine. And that's sort of the inception of movie serials. They really did come from newspapers and magazines published in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where you had serialized stories that kept people buying your magazines or your newspapers. It kept them involved. These days, it seems like everybody needs to be entertained at all times. If and we were on vacation last month, so we were around a lot of families with children, and I'm sometimes appalled at how people are raising their children now. They're all raising them, via tablet, and I don't. We were in some beautiful areas, and to see a 3-year-old watching some noisy children's programming on tinny speakers and on a phone, it was just blew my mind because like I said, we were in some beautiful areas. If you just looked around, you could see way more than you were ever going to see on that uh, uh, phone or tablet. But And it just drives me crazy. Back in the day, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you weren't you didn't have the expectation of being entertained, day in and day out. And entertainment was a luxury. It was expensive. You had to have the money to buy that magazine or that newspaper, and many people did not because they were living hand to mouth. And this is the early days of the Industrial Revolution too, and the changes brought on by the Industrial Revolution often play out, especially in some of these early serials. The movie that we think of a lot when we think of the first serial is not really the first serial. That's What Happened to Mary. But the first big serial, the one that kind of put serials on the map, is The Perils of Pauline, which came out in 1914, and it was produced by Pathé. Well, it was produced by Pathé Studios, but the real producer here was William Randolph Hearst, the famous newspaper magnate. So he knew quite a bit already about serialized stories. And he spent about $25,000 in order to make um, The Perils of Pauline. And that wasn't a great deal of money even in 1914, especially it ran 3 hours and 20 minutes and it was 20 chapters. That's pretty that's a long running time if you think about it. And some serials, especially as we move into the 1930s and 1940s, will approach 5 hours, which there again is a lot of programming. There's also a lot of repetition, however, in serials, which I'll address here pretty soon. And the repetition really comes from The Perils of Pauline. I think that's really where it started. Pearl White was the star of The Perils of Pauline. And at the time that this was shot, she was a 25-year-old actress. She had quite a bit of experience, making films. But films back then were very melodramatic affairs. Since you had no sound, you had no color. If you were lucky, you had title cards. The only thing you really had were expressions, and you didn't have a lot of close-ups back then, so you had to act it out for the back of the room. You had to go nuts with all of your facial expressions and your movements and such in order to convey the emotion in the story. You had to go very broad with it because, like I said, you didn't have opportunities for a lot of close-ups. Every edit was expensive, and a lot of them were just shot sort of like let's say a play would be, where you see the entire stage at one time and you don't get much in the way of close-ups. I mean, they used some, but not very many. And even when they did, it still looked like a paragon of overacting, and it was. But there again, they had to overact in order for everybody to understand what was going on and the pathos of the scene and such. So to modernize, it does look exaggerated, and it was exaggerated, but it was exaggerated because of the limitations of the technology at the time. But a lot of that exaggeration really carries through in this particular type of filmmaking. And interestingly, The Perils of Pauline was an East Coast production, not a West Coast production. It was, again, shot by Pathé, and it was shot in New Jersey, Staten Island, New York, and oddly enough, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm not really sure which scenes were shot where. And one of the reasons for that is we no longer have the entire serial that we can watch. Only bits and pieces of that original 3 hour and 20-minute, 20 chapter serial still exist, unfortunately. And the overwhelming majority of films made before 1929 are gone. There are tiny fragments of some people's careers. Theda Bara, who was the great vamp in the late but pre 1920. None of her films exist complete. They're just a few snippets, And she was a huge star back then. And it's a shame that time has lost or erased um, all of this history. There is a version of the Perils of Pauline, thanks to our friends in Europe, because 2 years after Pathé released the serial in 1914, they did a condensed version for Europe. And when they condensed it, they cut a number of scenes out of it and got it down to, I want to say they cut about a little more than half of it out. So they got it down to about 9 chapters. And it's, you don't, we're fairly sure that Pauline was never tied to a railroad track, but we're not entirely sure because those scenes could be missing. Um, it seems to be generally agreed upon that she was never tied to a railroad track, but she was this hapless heroine. She's good, and everybody who is trying to do away with her is evil. It's very black and white. But at the time, you needed that polarization in order to get your meaning across, because there again, all you had was this flickering black and white image without sound, no color. And the technology just wasn't good enough, or wasn't strong enough at that time in order to underact. You had to overdo it. We watch movies from the 30s and 40s now with Betty Davis and Joan Crawford, and people think that they're overacting. They're not, compared to the people in the silent movies, especially I want to say pre 1920, 1921. They're, like I said, they're very broad. The 1920s, the technology that emerged in the 1920s when it comes to filmmaking really changed a lot of what audiences were going to see. And it also started the rise of feature films. Before 1920, there had been some feature movies made, like D.W. Griffith, Birth of a Nation, things like that, that were much longer. But those were almost spectacles rather than just feature films. Most films at that time were still, maybe two reelers, maybe a little longer than that, but not by much. In the 1920s, that really changed, and you started getting movies that were like 60 minutes, 90 minutes, even a couple of hours. And that was a big change in, filmmaking. And a lot of that was brought about by improvements in technology. Early sound experiments started in the early 1920s. Technicolor, what we call two-strip Technicolor, had been developed around 1915 or so. And those developments began showing up in 1920s movies. The first two-strip Technicolor feature was, I can't remember the name of the movie, but it was released in, I think, around 1922 or so. And it was feature length, very expensive, because the early Technicolor was a very expensive process, and it required two different exposures of film projected at the same time. One was tinted red, one was tinted green. So when you watch early Technicolor movies, you don't get what we would consider true colors, and certainly not the bright, vivid Technicolor that you see in movies like The Wizard of Oz, or a lot of Carmen Miranda's films, like Down Argentine Way. Those have this bright colors, but those are three-strip Technicolors when they added blue to it, and then they pumped them so full of light that when they projected, they're just almost surreal to watch. Beautiful, I think. We just don't get color like that anymore. And if you watch one of those old three-strip Technicolor movies from the 30s or 40s, the color is just bright and vivid, and ripe, and lush. Looks great. The two-strip Technicolor movies were more pastel, I want to say, And there are like you see a lot of purples instead of blue. A lot of it is green or red. Um, so like skin tones tend to be very ruddy in them, almost cherubic in terms of redness in some people's faces. Um, but even at that, it was still better than a black and white image for a lot of people. And there are a couple of Mystery of the Wax Museum, which is a Fay Wray and Lionel Atwill film from 1932 or 1933, is a really good example of two-strip Technicolor that looks about as good as it was ever going to look on film. It's been restored, and you can get the restoration on Blu-ray. And I think the version I have is on Blu-ray, and it looks wonderful, especially for a movie that's now what 93 years old. Um, because of all these technological advances and the rise of feature films and the way films were marketed and packaged, the features began being accompanied by, let's say, two reelers. Sometimes these would be one would be a news reel, another would be a comedy short for let's say one of the silent just comedy teams like Laurel and Hardy. Did a number of silent films. Uh,
Or,
Pardon me.
or a cartoon.
Yeah, and you did get some black and white cartoons back then in the 1920s as well. And slowly but surely, serials started to be edged out. What changed things was the Great Depression, and the reason that serials became uh, sort of the studio's favorite sort of came back around in the 1930s. It was hard to get audiences to come out to see a movie because they might not have that nickel or that dime, to get into the theater. So the theaters had to make their programs look good, and they had to make sure that people thought that they were worth, giving up their, hard-earned money, what little bit that was. And, some people would even, go without food in order to be able to go to the movies because it was entertainment. It was something that they just really wanted to experience. And that's sort of when serials started making a comeback, and those are the ones that a lot of the ones that we remember fondly. Unfortunately, most of the serials that were produced before the early 1930s are either missing either in their entirety, or they're missing so many episodes that you can't really watch them, sadly.
I know I was always looking for a Hercules serial from 1910. And I looked for it for years. I didn't think I'd ever find a copy. And then I had taken a collection of early shorts from the library. And I had it on while I was exercising, doing other things. And there was the lost animated serial of Hercules, the 12 Laborers. So I immediately went on eBay and Amazon and found an inexpensive copy. I was able to track it down. That was a legend for years as far as
Excuse me. Now, as we get into the 1930s and 1940s, that's when we start to see serials take on more of sort of an episodic television look about them. And each one of them, like I said, some serials approached 5 hours, but you didn't necessarily, if you edited it right, you didn't necessarily have 5 hours of content because there was a lot of repetition in the serials. You got pretty much the whole background of the previous episode before the current episode starts. For those, I guess, for the benefit of those people who might have missed it, but it also pads the reel out quite a bit. I'm a little cynical, perhaps, but it actually did pad them out, quite a bit. But that was also part of the hoopla. And if you did miss the previous week's episode, it wasn't life changing or anything.
They did this thing on Dark Shadows. So my wife and I are watching the post Barnabas, Barnabas rising from the Sparkling episodes of Dark Shadows.
Mhm.
Watching it for a while now. And they summarize in the beginning, they have somebody giving a narration that's kind of vague, but pulls you into the bigger picture that's going on. And then they reenact the last scene from the previous episode, but it's slightly written, so it's sometimes it's even very different than you remember from the previous episode. And then I think it's the catch people who might have missed it or tuning in for the first time, so not fully lost as to what's going on.
But that really comes from movie serials.
Yeah.
That's where that starts. And it makes sense. And even with Dark Shadows, it did help kind of pad the program out because they were doing half an hour's worth of programming every Monday through Friday every day.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of work to do. And back then they didn't have the cushion that they have now. These days, and these are sort of the last days of soap operas, but these days they shoot soap operas. They're shot about 10 months before they're actually. So you have a long, wait between the time that it was recorded to the point where it's exhibited for an audience. You didn't have that with early soap operas because a lot of them were live, and you only had an outline of a script. You didn't necessarily have a fully fleshed out script, especially if you knew your character. You were just supposed to. You were given a kernel of what of an idea of what you were supposed to do, and then you went in and did it because you knew your character. And you get that a lot in soap operas, more so than any other kind of television program, because of the nature of how much programming that they have to churn out, on a daily basis. Soap operas originally started, on the radio, and they were called soap operas because some of the early ones were sponsored by soap companies like Ivory Soap or Lux or Cameo or one of those other old brands that you can't much find anymore, but were popular back then. And those were also very episodic, very repetitious, and they, along with movie serials, radio programs, sort of all came together in order to help form what we know as episodic television today. And I mean, there's a lot more to say about all of that, but just to set it up, though, we didn't really have much television programming until after World War II. The BBC has actually been, at least in the early days, the BBC was actually better about turning out programming uh, than than the United States was in the late 1930s. Um, by the late 1930s, well, I'll back up a little bit. The development of television was not really that much more advanced than the development of radio. Radio was developed around the turn of the 20th century. Television, some of the early trials were early 1920s, so there's just a span of a little more than 20 years between the two, which is kind of amazing if you think about it.
Yeah.
Early TVs had early television had horrible resolution, just a few lines, and you sort of vaguely make out, faces and such with some of the early tests, but they were so bad that it wasn't really feasible. But they worked on it and got better and better. And in the late 1930s, when televisions first became, available to the home market, And you started seeing them, demonstrated. I mean, the New York World's Fair of 1939 was sort of like a big kickoff for, and there were a lot of, oh, I don't want to say, just demonstrations of TV back then. Televisions in the late 1930s were horribly expensive and very crude, mostly with very tiny screens. Picture tubes back then were really long, and you had to have a very deep cabinet for them. But at the end, you had a picture that was completely round and only about that big. It might have been like 5 or 6 inches across diagonal, but very small. Some manufacturers would put instead of mounting the picture tube out front to back like this, would actually put it down in a cabinet. And then when you raise the lid of the cabinet, there was a mirror, and the mirror helped kind of magnify it. So it made it a little bit bigger, and that's how you were able to watch it. But early TVs were pretty crude, and we didn't really have a whole lot of programming for them. And they were mostly limited to a few big cities. And New York was sort of the biggest city of all. And by 1939, New York had about 5,000 television sets, which is a lot if you think about how expensive televisions were back then. I mean, they were more than cars. You could buy a 1939 Ford for about $700 or $800, but that TV was a lot more than that, and they were so dear, and really experimental, that most people didn't have them. And when World War II came along, that kind of knocked out any television production, because all of the tubes and such that were needed to build these TVs, and all of the minerals and other materials had to go for the war effort. So there was about a 3.5 year period there where no new televisions were being built. At the end of the war in 1945, you saw a gradual turnaround of factories. They were able to go back to building what they were. In the meanwhile, 4 or 5 years of war had also led to some technological advances. So the TVs that were built post World War II tended to be much better in terms of reliability, screen size, and resolution. But they were not they weren't great shakes. I don't If you remember watching TV as a kid, whether you were watching a color or a black and white screen, they were kind of fuzzy, and depending on your reception, you could fine tune them a little bit, with the apparatus that surrounded the channel selector. But they were, like I said, pretty fuzzy, right?
And you could do things like put aluminum foil on the antennas and wire hangers to it. Yeah, I remember those days.
Well, that by about 1948, 1949, the TVs had gotten a whole lot better, but they were still a little fuzzy, in terms of resolution, and that's just because that was the technology back then, and they just didn't have that many lines of resolution in the screens, and the screens were small. So if you were farther away from it, and they did start getting bigger in the late 1940s, but the farther away you got from it, it didn't look so fuzzy. It's kind of like a small photograph that somebody might scan and upload to the internet. If it stays small, if it stays kind of a thumbnail, it looks not too bad. It still looks pretty good. But if you start blowing it up, then it pixelates and looks horrible. And that's kind of a good um, explanation of what the early technology in terms of television. Um, all programming from television up until about 1956 with the advent and use of videotape, all programming was either done live or it was kinescoped. And a kinescope was the only way at the time that you could record live television broadcasts. And it was, it sounds kind of crude, but that you could actually buy kinescope machines, and they had a 16 millimeter movie camera bolted to what amounted to be a TV monitor. And the lens was directed at the TV monitor, and that's how they recorded television programs. It was not very efficient, but it was the only way that they had available to do it. It was done with 16 millimeter for a couple of reasons. Most television stations in the late 40s, early 1950s had access to 16 millimeter projection equipment, and the network wasn't completed from coast to coast until gosh, probably the 1960s. So you had to rely on copies for some of the outlying cities that weren't part of the network until they could get connected. So for some of your smaller cities and such, the kinescope was the only way you were going to see a lot of these early TV programs. And thanks to kinescopes, that's why you can still watch some early TV programming that's still around, like old game shows and some of the old the dramatic anthology series like Playhouse 90 and such. Those exist now only because of kinescopes.
Wow. So, and again, the images and the broadcasting at home is still evolving. And now we're in the AI age where we're getting close to not knowing what is real, no exaggeration needed, what is real and what is not real.
I'm getting better at figuring out what's AI. You can see it drives me crazy because on Facebook, all of a sudden people are using AI to do posters for their events, and they all look the same. They look exactly the same, and you could I look at it, this is AI, and it's creeping into like film and television production, which I really hate seeing. I really wish AI would go away. I don't think it's not adding anything to entertainment. In fact, I think it's just making it 10 times worse.
Yeah, I'm not going to play with it. I'm content not to experiment, but I know many people who are experimenting with it. And some of the hosts, even of our shows on Mount Olympus, are making the promos for the shows using AI.
And why? You don't need to do that. It doesn't look good. You are better off just doing it yourself, and whatever it comes out looking like, it comes out looking like. But at least it's honest. When you use AI, it looks like everything else. It's so it's homogenous to the point of just being boring. And it never looks right. People have like three heads, or I mean, three. I'm not three heads, but with three arms. It just never looks right. And I'm guessing that it will get better at some point, but I still don't care. I don't want. I don't want to listen to AI music. I certainly don't want to watch AI movies. I just don't find there's just nothing in there. There's no human element in it, and that's the whole reason to. That's the whole reason for entertainment. And when you remove that from it, what is it? What are you doing? What are you watching?
In the last Star Wars trilogy, they had Princess Leia and Grandma Tarkin. They weren't really there. You could tell that they were artificial back then. It was very easy to tell that they weren't real people. But as they improve on that, it might become more difficult. And there are many conversations with bringing back actors who passed on, putting them together in movies, play roles.
And I think that's gross. I mean, let these people die. And using their images, after they passed on. I mean, not only is it ghoulish, you're not paying that person.
All of
Hopefully the estate's getting something out of it,
seven state. So
that's just ugh. Oh God. I probably better get off my soapbox and talk about movie serials a little more. But one of the most fascinating things about movie serials is that it encompassed every film genre. In the early days, it was all melodrama, and 95% of what you saw at the Nickelodeon was melodramatic. Uh, but especially when we got into the 1930s, gosh, you had westerns being serialized. Those were usually done by really low budget studios. The serialized westerns, they were done by Mascot, Chesterfield. I mean, like the worst of the poverty row. They were still entertaining, but they had transparent budgets. They just didn't have much money. Um, some of the better serials were done by the big three studios that did serials, and they were all mid-tier: Republic, Universal, and Columbia. Now, Columbia was probably the worst of the three in terms of being Poverty Row. Columbia came out of Poverty Row. I mean, they were it was what we think of when we think of Monogram or Mascot. It was that low. And Columbia actually made it. They were actually be able to. They were actually rising up out of the ashes. And one of the ways that they did that was by movie serials. It was lucrative enough for them. They also knew how to make movies on a dime, which you really needed to be good at when you did a movie serial because these things were long. I mean, you're talking like, we'll say 3.5 to 5 hours was pretty typical for a serial. That's a lot of film to shoot. It's also a lot of background people. It's a lot of actors. If you look at the casts of movie serials, you'll have like two or three named stars, but everybody else is a character actor, and there's a lot of them because you've got 12 to 15 episodes. So there's a lot there to deal with in terms of production, and trying to hold the costs down on production had to have been difficult, especially when you were trying to do, let's say, a science fiction serial like Flash Gordon, which I think is one of the best, really. The Buster Crabbe Flash Gordon serial from 1936, in so many ways, is mind blowing. For one thing, trying to do something that looks futuristic is difficult because you're trying to look into the future and trying to figure out what things would look like. And I love how stylish Flash Gordon is. And it does give you sort of that almost comic book feel that is fairly common in films now, but back then was hard to get across because there you were looking at a black and white image. Comics tended to be in color, which was one of the things that was eye-catching about them. It was the use of color and such. But I think Universal did a great job with Buster Crabbe's Flash Gordon. Um, it's a lot of fun to watch, and there's some odd elements to it. I mean, Buster Crabbe, more often than not, is in fetish gear. When he's on screen, his hair's bleached blonde. It doesn't really look like him in a way. Um, but some of the visuals in it, I think, are just wild. Stuff that you weren't going to see any other studio turn. You weren't going to see MGM turning stuff like this out. But you would see some of the lower tiered studios turning it out because they had to have something to latch onto. They had to give you something. And it's fun. It's excellent programming. It's a lot of fun.
and it was greatly spoofed on with Flesh Gordon decades later.
Oh, have you ever seen that?
Yes, I have. I have both movies. The first
Oh,
cheerleaders. They changed it, even though it says original. I saw it in the theaters when it came out.
really? Wow.
Yeah,
Who were you?
and they did edit it, even though it says unedited in the original on DVD. They edited the movie heavily. I remember the original movie.
How old were you when you saw that?
Remember, I had a beard when I was 11, and I was,
Ah, okay, gotcha. Because that came out in what, like 73, 74, something like that. So you would have been, gosh, just a early teens, maybe.
yeah, I was in my teens.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah, I've seen it. We actually own a copy of it. Something, this is just standard DVD,
Yeah, I'm a copy of it too.
years ago. And I was excited to watch it. And then, oh, I've probably seen it one or two more times after that, but I guess it's fun. It's just not really, and I like crude stuff. And that's not a problem.
Me too.
It just seems a little easier than I wanted it to be. Um, Maybe that's just me. I don't. But yeah, that. I hadn't thought about Flesh Gordon for a long time, and then when Greg and I were talking about movie serials earlier, I mentioned Flash Gordon. He said, "Well, he said, do you want to watch Flesh Gordon again?" I'm like, "No,
I
just
watched her on a couple of months ago, I think. I was just cycling through some of the old science fiction movies and serials and whatnot, and I watched both of those.
anyway." I know I've been mentioning Republic, Columbia, and Universal a lot, but there were a couple of other studios that did some serials, but they weren't as invested in them as Republic, Columbia, and Universal. Monogram did some with super low budgets. I mean, way lower than what Republic or Universal um, were paying for their serials. These were really low budget affairs, and Monogram did do a lot of westerns. Um, so they tended to veer off onto the Western serials more than the other studios. RKO uh, made some serials as well, but they didn't do it as consistently as the other three studios did. But it taught these studios something too. I mean, Columbia and Universal is huge now. I mean, it's NBC. It encapsulates so many other things now. So Universal is a huge, studio. Columbia, Columbia, like I said, was a Poverty Row studio, and they were able to crawl out of Poverty Row, thank thanks in part to some serials and some actually really shrewd business moves on Columbia's part as well. And Republic, of the three, Republic's the one that didn't make it. Republic folded right after the death of serials in the mid 1950s. TV just buried, eventually buried serials, and it also buried a lot of things really in the 1950s. Trying to remember what the last movie serial was. It was from 1956, but I can't quite remember the name. I had it written down here somewhere, but I can't remember the title of it. But 1956 is really late for a movie serial, and after that, that was it. So they existed for, well, let's say 45 or so years. Um, that's a long run, and obviously, television production is the big thing that wiped out movie serials, because if you wanted to see, more of the same actor or more of the same storyline, TV was made for that. Episodic television was made for that, and in the early on, television programming, you didn't have a lot of linear narrative. Um, what you had oftentimes in television programming was like roller derby, studio wrestling, things that were really cheap and easy to shoot for TV shows. In the early 1950s, you did start getting more episodic TV programs like Tales from Tomorrow, which were anthology series for the most part. But one episode didn't really have anything to do with the next episode. So that TV started making up for lost time in the mid 1950s with that. And as soap operas and other radio programming made the jump over to television, movie serials just got squeezed out. But for a while, especially in the 1930s and the 1940s, serials kept theaters going, and they kept people, this largely kids, but they did keep people coming back to the theater, a week after week, so they could see the entire program, not just the serial, obviously, but that's certainly a big part of the package. Some TV or some, excuse me, some theaters in the 1930s to get people to come in would even give away glassware plates.
Yes, yes, yes. I was going to bring that up if you didn't bring it up.
Mm-hmm. Things of that nature. In a lot of that even continued to when I was a kid, like in the late 60s and early 1970s. Like whenever my mother would pull into the Esso station to get gas, she would get a glassware or depending on how many stamps that she had collected from Esso. I actually have some of the stuff that she got. If you remember the comic strip BC,
Yes.
um, where everybody's a cave person. I've got the cookie jar. I have the cereal bowls, which are Anchor Hawking, but in their pressed glass. But they look like they've been chiseled, out of stone, but they're glass, like I said. Mugs, things of that nature, and those all came from Esso gasoline. And my mom had she had some rocks glasses as well with Detroit Lion. I think she still has them somewhere, but with the Detroit Lions logo on it, and really nice rock glasses. Uh,
Sinclair dinosaurs. Well, both the thing that I remember getting dinosaurs at Sinclair Fish.
Sinclair. Mm-hmm.
And that's an old custom. They found the glasses and plates giving away gladiator games in Rome in someone's attic not too long.
And and even when you went to the grocery store, you got Top Value stamps or S&H Green stamps,
Yes.
something of that nature. And I was the keeper of the stamps as a kid, so like when my mom would go to the grocery store, she would bring back stamps, and I had to put them in the books. And the little 1 cent stamps were nasty because you had to completely cover the page with them, and that meant lots of saliva, to lick the stamp and put it. Kind of gross, but it was also kind of fun after you had so many books of stamps saved up to take them to the stamp store. And usually, I think we had a catalog too, and you could.
Yeah, there were catalogs. So each one, I remember Tropicana even had a catalog of the famous with the stamps in boxes. If you worked in a grocery store, you had access to them. Or if the grocery store near you didn't participate, you threw out the boxes, you take them off the box, and you get a catalog.
Well, one thing that I remember getting for my birthday as a kid came from the stamp store, and it's a Buddy L auto carrier. It's big. I actually have it in my home now. It's blue. It's probably, I don't know, 2.5 feet long. Nice toy, and it had plastic Olds cutlasses that were the cars on the carrier itself.
Very cool.
It is, and it's oddly enough for me still in great shape too. Uh, and you got, I think stamp stores died probably early 1980s or something like that, but they were fun when I was a kid.
60. I remember the stamps from the 60s and early 70s.
I think we had stamps like up until the 80s. I can't remember the brand of stamps. It might have been Top Value TV stamps, the yellow ones. I think it might have been. But I can remember like in high school, still like going to the stamp store because it was right beside the grocery store that we went to and picking up things for my dorm room because I was graduated from high school and needed some stuff for college. And I can remember going to the stamp store and getting a lamp and stuff like that because we had the books of stamps.
You said camping equipment.
You did see a lot of that in stamp store books. You're
Yeah,
right. Forgotten about that. And they always had these pie in the sky um, products that no one ever saved up
yes,
for. They would have like a Volkswagen Rabbit or
yeah.
a little compact car that you could get if you had like 5,000 books of stand, something crazy. I don't know that anybody ever got one of those out of
Just
them.
strive for it.
How would you? What would you have to buy in order to get that many stamps to get the car?
Well, it's like buying the lottery ticket. You know your chance of winning are minuscule, uh, if at all. But it gives you permission to dream big for a little while.
I got to tell you, I'm not a gambler. I hardly ever play the lottery, and when I have, I don't think I've ever won a dollar. That's I consider myself a lucky person, but I don't have luck like that. I don't have luck in games of chance at all.
I don't gamble either. There were some periods where I bought the lottery tickets, and I think the most I won was $500.
Ooh, that's
Uh,
pretty good.
yeah,
My mother's pretty lucky. And she's never won like a huge jackpot, but she's won some decent ones over the years. And like I said, I'm not a gambler. She actually is, and when she goes to a casino, more often than not, she walks out of there with more money than she brought in. That is not me. I don't have luck like that at all. Well, Greg and I, this was years ago, like that way back in the early 90s. We had gone to Las Vegas and we were staying at the Sahara, which has since been knocked down, but it was one of the original hotels on the strip. And we were in the casino and playing the one armed bandits. And at the time, if you won like up to a certain amount, it would just give you tokens. You didn't have the little paper um, I don't know what receipts or whatever they are that you have now when you go gambling to cash out. You just got
yeah,
like I said tokens, and I hit right at the same time that the Sahara caught on
ooh,
fire. And they were trying to evacuate me, and I said I'm not going anywhere until somebody cashes me out. And somebody came, cashed me out, and I left, and I haven't won since then. That was probably like 35 years
one dramatic one.
ago. Well, but I guess at some point I somehow knew that I was going to win again, so I wanted and it was significant for the time. It was probably like I don't know, a couple $100, 200 or 300, something like that. But and I never won anything like that afterward.
I went to the casino maybe 4 times, twice on the East Coast and twice in Las Vegas.
Mm.
Uh, all 4 times I said the limit is how much I'm willing to lose. And um, it was pretty even. I think I won more than I came in with in two of them, and the other ones I lost. But I already said the limit of what I could afford to lose. When I reached that, that was it. I just stopped playing.
I've only used a claw machine, I think, once in my whole life. Speaking of games of chance, I was a little kid. I was a kid, probably like 7, 8, 9 years old, something like that. And a friend of mine at the time, each had a quarter, and he put his into the claw machine, and he didn't win anything. And I put mine into the claw machine, grabbed this bee. It was a stuffed bumblebee, and got it. And I thought, I'm ahead of the game. I've never played this again.
And you won.
Yeah, I guess.
Then show it will end with your winning your bee.
I'm not sure. I liked my Bumblebee, but I'm not really sure what became of it.
Watch it turn up now. The universe telling you you're still lucky.
It probably will. I'll probably you find it at my mom's house or something.
Someone might give you one. I don't know where they had a feeling to give you this bee. So that might
It looked a little bit like Busy Bee in oh God, what's the Best in Show? The Christopher Guest, Michael McKean improv movie from about 2000 or so, where Parker Posey and her husband have a Weimaraner that they are taking to the dog show, and the Weimaraner has this toy that they call Busy Bee. It looked something like that. Not exactly, probably not as nice as Busy Bee was, but
that might be a prophecy of some sort. So, once owner of the Busy Bee, how can people reach you and how can they get more in tune with the Brian Struggle Theater beyond your podcast?
well, you're not going to see me at a claw machine or a casino, but if you want to interact with me on social media, you can find me on Facebook. You can run a search for Brian's Driving Theater. I should pop up. And also, you please visit the website, Brian's Drive-In Theater. There's a new movie of the day every day. I also update birthdays, and uh, I'm in the site every day working on it, trying to improve it. And hopefully, you'll stop by and see what we offer.
And I've been a fan for over a quarter of a century since the very early days of Brian Struggle Theater. I've reported several times that I used to copy the pages in case it went down and disappeared. And I started looking through some loosely binders that we just dug up in the attic of the basement. And I'm finding stuff from that era. So who knows, I might stumble onto the copies of your website from days of yore. We do a special to compare what was then and what is now.
Yeah, hopefully, it looks somewhat different.
It did. It still has that feel of retro, but it's evolved over the years. Great. It's
The
still a
most
great.
retro thing about it is the HTML code, but yeah, really.
Brian, thank you. Be well. Say hi to Greg, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Okay, take care, Hercules.
Thanks, you too.
Good night.
Good night.